Madeline, it's all yours.
Awesome. Just 1 second and I will share my screen. Okay. Hopefully that's showing properly for you.
Yeah, it's fantastic.
Alrighty. So, hi everybody. My name is Madeline Vanderpelt. I am a senior software engineering manager at Diligent, as Yuri has mentioned. Today I'm here to chat about embracing microservice ownership and what that means. And the reason I'm so passionate about ownership is because I'm actually really passionate about making developers' lives easier, simplifying the software development lifecycle, simplifying the tools that we use, the processes that we have, and ultimately making it easier to deliver code, easier to deploy to production, and to do it with less pain and frustration. So I lead the developer enablement and developer productivity team at Diligent. It's a small team. There's just 2 of us right now, but we're hoping to grow. And yeah, that's a little bit about me. As I mentioned, today we're going to talk about microservice ownership. And before we get there, I want to chat just a little bit about monoliths versus microservices, the shift to DevOps and the impact that that's had on how we deliver software and how we work as teams. And then also, obviously, microservice ownership itself. Throughout the sort of session today, I'm going to have questions for you. It's very much interactive. If you have questions for me as well, I can't really see the chat, but maybe if you raise your hands, I can see that on the screen here. So I think Zoom has that ability. There will be a little poll that Yuri's going to put up in the middle for me. So I encourage you to kind of jump in and join the conversation and share your experiences. I'll be sharing mine, and I'd love to learn from you as well tonight. So hopefully it'll be fun. Hopefully you'll indulge me and come along for the ride. So to start, we're going to talk about microservices versus monoliths. Depending on your experience, you may be familiar with microservices and monoliths, but I wanted to recap just briefly so that we're all on the same page. So monoliths, generally you have one code base. It starts out small perhaps, but it gets larger and larger as our business needs grow, as we add features to our system, as our teams grow. And pretty quickly, a lot of things within that monolith can become interdependent and rely on one another and get a little intertwined. Some people call it spaghetti code. I like that visual personally. Now, when it comes to deploying these systems, you only have to deploy one system. So it's a little easier maybe to wrap your head around how to do that. But it can also be riskier because you can make a small change to one part of that system and unintentionally affect another piece of that system. On the other hand, we have microservices, which have separate code bases for separate business functions, maybe different services that all work together to achieve what you're trying to do as a platform or as an application. These independent components have to be able to communicate to each other, though. So you use typically event-driven architectures or APIs or different things for them to talk to each other and pass information, signals from one system to another so that the entire architecture can do what it needs to do. Requires a bit more thought up front because you have all these things that are talking to each other. If you think about people, it's a lot easier to organize one person and tell them where to go and what to do than it is to organize 20 people and get them all to communicate effectively with each other, right? However, that said, it's easier to modify smaller pieces of that system and add features or replace things without affecting anything else in the system. You have to keep those boundaries though, right? So I believe that both of these architectures exist for a reason. You hear a lot of things online about how monoliths are bad. We shouldn't ever have one anymore, and everybody should go to microservices. And I think that there's a place for both. Depending on your application size, the complexity, the size of your team and their skill sets, developing a microservice takes a different skill set than developing a monolith. Generally, microservices are deployed to the cloud, and maybe you've been deploying a monolith on a server that you own, right? It takes a different skill set. As well, if you're just prototyping something or you're a team of 2 people, having to manage a lot of microservices might be a lot of overhead, or might be something that you don't have the capacity to take on. So the size, the team skill sets and competency, the infrastructure, all these things can play into that decision making. As I mentioned, I'm going to share some of my experiences with you as well. So I wanted to start off with my journey with monoliths. Some of you on the call might actually remember this because you were there. But when I first started as a developer, fresh out of school, all bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, I joined a cybersecurity company, and I worked on a monolithic piece of software. And my job as a Java software developer was to fix bugs, create features, write code, basically. I was responsible for that development work. And when I had completed that development work, I would hand it over to somebody else who would do quality assurance on it and do the testing. And they would hand it back to me and tell me, hey, this needs to be fixed, or everything looks good. And we'd go back and forth until we decided that it was ready to go to production. Then when it was ready to go to production, I would merge that code. And it took forever to merge it because there were so many people developing on the monolith that the pipeline would rebase and run and rebase and run, but eventually it would merge. And then I would have to wait and wait and wait because it would take 2 weeks to deploy the monolith for our SaaS solution. And I think the on-premise solution took like months. So you wouldn't see your code at work for a while in that case. So one of these times I waited for 2 weeks for this change to be merged, and turns out it had a bug in it. And I broke one of the screens on our web app with my one-line change that looked really simple, and that got QA'd and reviewed and everything else. And I scrambled, I panicked. I scrambled and I put a hotfix together, and I worked with the operations team, and they got the hotfix deployed. And that took probably a couple of days. And it deployed, and I was about to breathe a sigh of relief when I went and looked at it and realized that I had fixed the bug, but I had broken something else, and I actually made it worse by deploying this hotfix. So then I got even more panicked and I went back to work and I put out another hotfix, and I thought for sure that I was going to be fired. I was like, been a developer for 2 months and I'd broken everything in production, and I was super embarrassed and super anxious and worried about all of this. And thankfully, I had a team who was super supportive, and we talked it through and figured out what we could do differently with our processes and our systems to prevent this from happening again, which was really awesome. But one of the things I learned is that it was so easy to make, for a simple change, to make a bigger impact than what you intended it to do. And with the monolith being so large, it was impossible to test every single use case to ensure that that wouldn't happen. So this simple 1 or 2 line change that I'd made, I couldn't actually have the confidence in that change that I needed. Even after going through quality assurance and testing and code reviews, I didn't have the confidence that it wasn't going to break something else. So since then, I've been working pretty hard with all of the teams that I've worked on to increase our level of confidence when we're trying to deploy a change and we're trying to ensure that it's tested properly. So, as I mentioned, I have some questions for you as well. my first one is, what experiences have you had with monoliths or microservices? And I would appreciate it if you can come off mute and share with us, or you can use the chat if you'd prefer. Looks like Yuri's already jumped.
Like because like first of all, thank you for question. And actually, I have question for you, but it will be later. In the beginning, like I would prefer to answer your question. Like what experience? Like absolutely similar to your experience. Absolutely similar to your experience because like from what I saw, like multiple different people like and myself, including myself, went through the same absolutely identical situation. It doesn't matter how experienced we were, like with service, we always had some cases, some corner cases, because like you were not aware of some developer changed totally different thing. It took two weeks, and after that everything went to production. And actually, you get to this state, and this state it's quite interesting. You always think like it's the worst things that happened with me. Like I definitely will be fired. It creates so a lot of pressure. And you know what I noticed, like with monoliths, we stayed like you stay in this state like much longer. Like because like for monolith, you stay in the state like for a couple days, like as you mentioned, like for a week. But with microservices, sometimes you get to the same things, but it's much faster, and you stay in this state like 5-10 minutes, and it's much easier to handle because like in general, like it's amount of pressure that you create, like the system create on you, it's huge difference. Cognitive load, stress, almost everything.
Yeah, you bring up some really good points, Yuri, around the cognitive load and the stress and having to manage all of those other things that could go wrong and just being more worried about that. Igor in the chat also mentioned if you do distributed monolith but pretend it's microservices, you can run into a lot of the same problems where things can have unintentional side effects.
Yeah. Moreover, like I think personally, I think distributed monolith even worse than like regular one, because it's infinitely more complicated just to debug, and it's much easier to make mistakes.
Yeah. Andrew?
Yeah, I'm new to this group, so hi, my name is Andrew. I don't have my video on, I'm sorry. It's kind of rude of me. My name is Andrew. And where I'm at, I don't even know if my logo's in there, so I might as well say I work at Sonatype. Anybody that works in Java, anybody that works with Java should kind of sort of recognize that name. We run Central. We have an interesting mix of microservices, a big monolith that we call a RESTful service, and we're making a shift to from on-prem software to SaaS. And there's some interesting dynamics happening there. Our SaaS versions of our products are really quite literally broken out into function worker nodes for the various functions, but there's still the monolithic version of the app. So IQ running as IQ. There's worker nodes for firewall, worker nodes for lifecycle, and they are literally just running IQ. And then you have a look at Central, and Central's broken itself out into a distinct set of actual microservices, and in some cases backing themselves against a what we refer to as the majestic monolith. The relaunching of the monolith as a SaaS type service without taking into consideration breaking out functional domains into distributed monolith, without breaking out services into their functional domains, has really led to some interesting side effects. You run into scenarios where someone running a report on a worker node might be impacting other customers on that same worker node that are looking at other functional areas of the app. So, and it becomes difficult to understand, who's responsible for who's actually responsible for triaging and then ultimately fixing what's there. So.
Yeah, I like that you mentioned the responsibility of that too, because I think it plays a big part in how quickly we can respond to incidents, how quickly we can put out features, how quickly we can resolve security vulnerabilities. If nobody knows who's responsible for something, it's just gonna sit there on a backlog until it gets really, really old and people get really concerned. And we'll get into ownership a little bit too. I really liked Darren put something in the chat as well and said the difference between, so you have issues with both microservices and monoliths, but the difference is whether those issues end up impacting production or are caught in advance. And I definitely can relate to that. I think with my experience in monoliths, it was hard to catch a lot of things in advance. Whereas with microservices that are maybe smaller, easier to wrap your head around, easier to test if they're architected well, you can catch a lot more of this stuff before it goes to production. So that's a really great comment. Distributed monolith, heard it for the first time. Would it be right to say it's just following microservice ideology? Sorry, Yuri, did you want to?
I want to ask my question because I had my question like for you as I said.
Okay.
Uh,
Are you there, Yuri?
like I'm pretty sure like Payam has a question or want to share his experience.
Okay, then I'll pause for a second. So yeah, a distributed monolith is basically when you sort of follow the idea of breaking apart the monolith, like you might with microservices, but you don't actually decouple or detangle it in the process. So you still end up with a lot of those interconnected dependencies where things aren't necessarily communicating effectively with each other. Is that a fair description? Anybody want to add to that? You can. It's in the chat.
Yeah, I can relate that back to what I was just talking about. So, um, who was actually asking the question? Was it Yuri or?
Uh, Ivish, I believe, asked in the chat.
Okay. So in the IQ server, there's two primary pieces of functionality, lifecycle and firewall. And we have worker nodes. They're all web nodes. We've got worker nodes for each piece of functionality. And then we also have batch processing, and we call those batch worker nodes. They're the things that do the scanning and reporting. IQ does SBOM and SCA. All three of those node types just have IQ server installed. Some of them are only taking batch jobs and aren't receiving any web traffic. And the other two node types are receiving traffic, basically path-based routing, based on whether or not you're after lifecycle or firewall. But they're all just IQ. So yeah, it's kind of making at least in my world, it's kind of making a rather subjective split on functionality in your application, and in hanging another install of your application on a given node type to do a thing, but it's not really it's not really microservices. It could run the full workload if it wanted to.
Thanks for sharing. I am.
Oh, if there's still time. I was just going to share that I think the most interesting part of it is how your data is. So if you can't split it if your data doesn't naturally split well for microservices, then I guess that's how distributed microservices emerge, and then everything just hurts. So it's kind of like microservices by just at the logical level, but going to a single database is still not very difficult. It's like many different Lambda functions going to one. You can still reason about it. You can make big changes transactionally if you're using a relational database. But as soon as the data splits, but your actual business keeps requiring the data across all of them, then you just enter that new world of pain. At least that's how it has, the experience has played out.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
there's one in the chat as well that said, sorry, this is from Michael, says that there's an assumption that there's only two options, microservices or monoliths, and in reality, it's more of a spectrum with microservices on one end and monoliths on the other, and most things are actually sort of in between. And I can kind of relate to that too, right? I've seen what you might even call like a nano service where they're like teeny tiny and almost too broken down. And you kind of wonder why you went that far with it. And then I've also seen monoliths that are like crazy huge and massive, and nobody in the company understands how the whole thing works. And so they get really hard to maintain and manage. You had a question as well for me, Yusuf?
Yeah, question for you. In the beginning of this event, you mentioned there are some teams where like monolithical architecture fits quite well. Could you just elaborate or like bring examples, for example, what do you think about how it might work?
When a monolith fits?
When monolithic architecture like fits well, it means like you mentioned that monoliths or microservices, but at the same they can coexist. It means like for some teams it might be monolithic architecture, and for some of them microservices will work.
Yeah, I think sort of going back to what Payam said, where when your data splits, right, there's easier logical breaks sometimes for microservices, like, you know, a billing service versus an authentication service versus user management, right? But I think also if you're maybe a startup and you're a small team and there's only a couple of you, like, you know, let's say a handful of people, having to manage 10 different microservices might be too much, especially if you don't have the skill set or you're not equipped to do that. So in that case, it might be easier if you're a startup and you're getting off the ground and you're just trying to rapidly prototype things. Monolithic might be the right place to start. And that doesn't mean you necessarily stay there either, right? You could start there with your prototype, and then the boundaries and where things should be split might become clearer as well. Because as I mentioned, it kind of takes a lot of upfront thinking about your full system and how you want to design your system if you're going to do microservices right out of the gate. So if you're rapidly prototyping to see if something works, you might not want to put all that effort into it right out of the gate. It really depends on what your priorities are, where your skill sets are, and what you want to learn about too, I think.
Okay. Thank you so much.
All right, I'm going to move us along. But please feel free to keep chatting in the chat. All right, our next section, I wanted to talk a little bit about the shift to DevOps and how that's sort of shaping the way that we work. DevOps has been a buzzword for a few years now, and I have a little quiz for you before we dive further into the topic. Yuri, if you could run the poll for me, please. What is DevOps? Which one of these definitions rings the most true for you? And maybe Yuri, I can't really see. So if you let me know when you think everybody's
51%, 53, 58. 66, 69.
And if you don't know, if you've never done DevOps before or never heard of DevOps before, feel free to just take a guess as well.
75. Just a little bit more answers. It looks like it's stale. It looks like people might be a little bit hesitant to answer. Like, I will end. Is it okay?
Yep. Let's close the poll.
Should I share results?
Sure. Let's see what everybody voted for first.
We're all data driven. Let's see the results. There we go.
Ooh, okay. So I gave you 3 options. I said a team that creates infrastructure and deploys software to the cloud using CI/CD, which would imply that DevOps is a team. The second one said a tool that development teams can use to speed up software delivery, which would imply DevOps is a tool. And the third one says a way of working that breaks silos and increases collaboration across functional groups, which won out. So that is in fact the way that I phrased it for today. It hurts my soul a little bit whenever I see a posting for a DevOps person. Because DevOps at its core is really a cultural change. It's a way of working. It's a collection of cultural changes, practices, and tools that collectively break down walls that used to exist between teams. Teams like the development team and your operations teams, right? Hence DevOps. And it ultimately has the goal of improving communication and improving the way that software is delivered and the software development lifecycle is managed. So if you have one person or a small team of people doing DevOps, it's not really meeting that criteria of being a cultural change that applies across your organization. It's not a job, it's not a tool. Thank you, Andrew. Yeah, that's exactly what I was about to say. It's a way of working. It's a way of thinking about solving problems. It's a way of approaching how you do development. So keeping that in mind, how has DevOps changed the way that we work as within our organizations? Many of you might be familiar with team setups that look like this, where you have a development team and they just do development. They create features, they do bug fixes, all that good stuff. Then you might have site reliability engineering or SRE, and they do things like responding to incidents, managing customer issues, monitoring your applications, maybe even helping you figure out how to optimize things and keep your uptimes where they need to be, meeting your service level objectives. You might have a quality assurance team or QA people who maybe manually test things or write automation to test your applications. You might have an operations team that deals with deploying things to production, building pipelines. And all of these people have very defined roles and tasks. And often when I hear of a DevOps team, it's really a rebranding of an operations team, which is why I put that sort of trick question in there. A lot of times they take the people who are doing CI/CD work, which is continuous integration and continuous delivery, or creating pipelines and pushing our code to production, and they relabel that from operations to DevOps because they do things that involve infrastructure maybe or deploying code. I'd like to break that misconception right here and now. So when we break down the barriers between these teams, we go from having these groups of people with very specific functions to having teams of people who have broad skill sets in all of these different areas that are aligned on delivering a specific piece of value. So you might have a team that has people who were traditionally developers or traditionally in operations, now working together, communicating, collaborating to get to their objectives and get to their goals. So it's really about communication at the end of the day, right? And enabling these people to talk to each other and work with each other effectively. Another word for a team like this can be called a streamlined team. I took some of this inspiration from a book called Team Topologies by Matthew Skelton and Manuel Pace. And it's a good book, check it out. I have a lot of book recommendations. I do a lot of reading.
I'll plus one that. That's an awesome book.
Thanks, yeah. So if you've ever read it, you might be familiar with a couple of terms I'm going to use here. So stream-aligned teams are aligned to delivering a piece of value for your customers or for your organization. That piece of value could be a user journey. It could be a specific service. It could be something like enabling your authentication for your users. Really, it's just a specific piece of value, and you're all coming together to achieve that. Streamlined teams, the idea with bringing all these people with the different skill sets together is that you're empowered to work as a team independent of other teams to deliver your value safely and quickly and independently of those other teams. A really cool thing that comes along with this is shortened feedback loops. The teams are actually closer to their customers because they're the ones who are deploying the code and knowing whether or not it worked successfully. They're the ones who are responding to alarms and customer issues, and they can actually see how their applications are performing. And if you're focused on a specific value stream, then you can also create clear boundaries and clear priorities for those teams so that if something comes along and it doesn't align to that value stream, you can find the right owners and the right value stream that it does apply to. On the flip side, there are challenges with this, as with anything. Shifting to streamlined teams and getting all these people who were in traditionally QA roles or had been on a site reliability engineering team to work together, it requires changing the expectations of their roles. It's a cultural change, and that means it's going to take time for people to learn those new expectations, apply them, start working together, remember to do certain things. It also means there's going to be knowledge gaps within the teams. You won't have all the skills automatically that you're going to need to solve a problem. So what you need is other people or other resources to help you fill those gaps. Also, having clear boundaries only works if we maintain those boundaries. So that can be a challenge, especially if you're short-staffed or you've got a lot of things you need to do and not a lot of time to do them in. But maintaining those boundaries is really essential in order to be able to deliver the value that you're trying to deliver. There's a couple other types of teams that the book mentions, and there's three other ones actually. Enabling teams, platform teams, and complicated subsystem teams. So enabling teams are specialists in certain areas. So this is where the people who had traditionally been fully on a site reliability engineering team or an operations team can be super helpful and super effective. As I mentioned, the teams themselves, the development streamlined teams, might not have all the skill sets that they need to own operations in its entirety. So having people who are seasoned veterans in operations working as enablers, they can come in and help those teams learn and grow so that they are able to do all of those things. The platform team is actually basically what my team does at Diligent right now. Platform teams enable streamlined teams to become more autonomous. So they're building tools to help reduce cognitive load so that we don't have to think about the 10 million different ways of doing something, but rather pick from a smaller subset of things that we know will work for our use case. And we have to have a really strong focus on reliability, because if people can't trust our tools, then they're not going to use them. And we have not succeeded in reducing the mental strain on everybody. Complicated subsystems are for those parts of the code that require really specialized knowledge. Maybe you have a team that are experts in AI and have built certain tools or parts of the system that other things are going to need to integrate with. And their job is to make integrating with those super specialized things as easy as possible. So I went from working on that monolith to a new little team, same company. We were a little spin-off team. We discovered that we really had no insight into how our monolith, the customers who were using the monolith, who were using the on-premise software, we had no insight into how they were using the software and whether things were working as they expected them to or not. We had a little bit better insight into the SaaS solution, but what we decided was we needed to be able to get metrics and data about how our application was operating for the people on premise. And to do that, they created this little team, which was myself and I think 2 interns. I was still pretty much a new grad. I think I had like 6 or 8 months of experience at this point. And we had to create something that would integrate with the monolith, but wasn't part of the monolith itself. We were basically given free rein of how to do that and settled on deploying to the cloud in AWS and using serverless methodology. And it was incredible. It was a huge learning journey. We had no idea what we were doing at the beginning, absolutely none. It took a lot of experimentation, a lot of learning. We had no dedicated quality assurance people. We had no operations people. We had no site reliability engineering. It was just, like I said, myself and a couple of interns and our team lead. And in a way, it was actually a really formative experience for me, because we just had to figure it out for ourselves. There was no other option. So we sat with the people that we used to work with on operations, and we learned how they created pipelines and what went into a good pipeline. And we sat with the people who used to monitor the applications and asked them about metrics and what made a good metric and what to do when an alarm went off and how to create alarms and how to do these things as code. And we did a lot of research on the internet, and we tried things, and some of it failed and some of it worked. But what I'm immensely grateful for in that experience is that we were given the time to actually experiment and learn and figure these things out. And ultimately, a big part of the organization shifted to using streamlined teams and doing things with serverless and doing things in AWS. And we got to sort of pioneer some of that. So it was a really, really cool place to be for me. Really shaped a lot of the way that I think about building applications now. And thinking about how we use streamlined teams and how we were completely left to our own devices as a team to really figure it out together and work together and collaborate. We had to go talk to all those other people that we wouldn't have normally had to talk to. And we got to take advantage of all their experience. So next round of chit chat. How has DevOps impacted the way that you work? Feel free to, yeah, Yuri.
Yeah, like actually it's significantly impacted because like I remember it was many years ago, like and it was not even the DevOps, it was mostly operations team and development teams. And uh, there were like some processes in company, and we built executable files like or DLLs and send it by using emails. I remember this time, and it was like very painful because like eventually you end up in very weird state of application. You were trying just to kind of to find proper combination of different DLLs. It was one approach, and for example, right now I'm working in a company where we can deliver to production each 5 minutes. And I used to work in a company like before where we actually delivered 8 times a day. It means almost every hour. And again, it's mostly about stress. I noticed that myself, teams that I'm working with, when you deliver often, you have significantly less stress. When you deliver like with such DLL, you always get into weird state. It's not even related to monolith or like microservices. It's related to kind of amount of changes, and because of that maturity of your DevOps processes, it always have significant impact on happiness. And for example, like again, as maturity of DevOps, I see rollbacks culture in many companies adopting, working. There are a lot of great guidance from AWS about rollback strategies, how to use it. It might be done in Kubernetes. Again, companies that using such approach, teams that using this approach, I think they significantly more happy.
Yeah, I really resonated with what you said about making deployment less stressful. Definitely when I had things that were being deployed in every 2 weeks, I didn't even remember sometimes that I'd merged something that was getting deployed because it was so long between when I merged it and it getting into the hands of customers. And I'd done so many other things in the meantime that if something did go wrong with it, it was hard to get back into the mindset of what I was doing when I first made that change. Whereas with continuous integration, continuous delivery, and owning that with my team rather than relying on someone else to do it, we can make changes. Basically, the bottleneck becomes how quickly can your pipeline build it, and how quickly can you build it and test it and have confidence in it. So yeah, we deploy multiple times a day, sometimes once a day. Depends what we have to put out. It goes out as soon as it's ready. And the really awesome part about that is that you can actually see the value that you just delivered being used by people right away. You can see the impact, you can see the adoption rates go up. You can, if you have metrics and things that give you more visibility. And it's really cool, especially when like my team right now, we're building tools that are used internally by other teams. We get to see as soon as people start using that, we get that immediate feedback, and it's really rewarding for me personally, at least. Greg?
Yeah, I think for me, not only did having a DevOps mindset improve just my own abilities as a developer, but I think it also improved the way that I saw software as a business. In a sense, it almost allowed me to think a little bit more as an entrepreneur in this space, where you start to realize that often the bottlenecks of software don't just end in the code that you're writing, but also how it's getting deployed to customers, which customers is it going out, how frequently are we getting feedback, how high quality is that feedback, what can we observe in the production environments, and pushes myself and certainly my peers to think about, what is sort of the true value of a software company, but the ability to go from idea to production, that end to end value, and optimizing for that kind of lead time, right? Because it's that kind of lead time, idea to users receiving value from that idea, that's actually causing the success of software industries. So it forces your entire software development department to think very critically about that because they have more ownership over the end-to-end lifecycle.
Yeah, I like the way you put that. And I think the more visibility you have, the more excited you are about what you're putting out, the more invested you are in seeing people use it. And it kind of feeds back into itself and makes you, like you said, think more critically about what you're building and how are people going to use it and how is it going to work with the rest of the system. Eric?
I used to be a DevOps engineer previously, and I feel like how it's helped me or how it's impacted me is I feel like I can do things more autonomously because of all these little technical skills and knowledge that I built up that I can apply when I'm actually like deploying my changes and debugging incidents and things like that. And another thing is I think it really prepared me for the mindset of like you build it, you own it, which I think is kind of like the trend that a lot of software companies, our software teams are being organized like more and more. I think just having those skills and knowledge is super useful in that kind of environment.
Thanks. Yeah, for sure. I would agree with that. Last one, maybe Payam.
Sure. I think DevOps, a little bit along the lines of what also Greg said, it allows you to understand fully how software is getting to the customer's hand. And that first lets you understand what is the simplest way to have the highest level impact change by knowing more of the stack of your application, not just one layer. So I think that's a key part. And whenever people find out how the infrastructure works and what options are available, they realize they actually have many options, and some options are just much easier at an infrastructure level. And that increases engagement. And I think the alternative is when you don't have it, then you just have a whole lot of meetings because you have to coordinate, and that is just so much worse.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, there's a couple of comments in the chat. I don't have time to go through them all. But one mentions in interviews, if someone asks you, our developers can build their own continuous integration, continuous delivery pipeline. We expect the same from you. And their question is sometimes, but then what does the DevOps team do in the organization? The whole point is that there might not be a DevOps team or an operations team that is dedicated to creating those pipelines for you. The idea behind DevOps is that it's a cultural change where we're all working together on that streamlined team to deliver our code, and that includes building the pipelines. And it might not just be you, right? There'd be other people on your team that would have maybe more skills in that area or less than you. Everybody's on different points in their learning. But the idea is that you own that. And we're about to get, it's a great segue, I suppose, to microservice ownership. Okay, so I wanted to take a look at this from the point of view of the software development lifecycle. There's pretty common themes here or areas of software development lifecycle that you probably all have encountered before. Architecture and design, getting requirements, figuring out how you want to go about meeting those requirements, what you're going to build, how it's going to work, how it integrates with other things, the actual components that you need to build, and implementation, where you actually go and you code it. And this is typically where the development team tends to sort of operate within, is these two components. And then you have deployment. So maybe creating a pipeline for continuous integration and continuous delivery, or actually doing that deployment from getting that code from GitHub out into production, wherever that lives. Might involve some infrastructure. All of that is generally associated with an operations team. Then you have your operations and monitoring, which might have a bit of overlap between your operations team and your site reliability engineers, where you're watching those applications in production, you're responding to alerts, you're looking for dips in availability, things like not meeting a service level objective that you've defined for your customers. And then incident response, typically this would be your site reliability engineering team who's responding to alarms when they go off in the system, and customer issues, all of those sort of things. But what we're saying is with this shift to DevOps, our team is owning the entire software development lifecycle from end to end, everything in between. So not just how do we want to build it and what are we building and actually building it, but how do we deploy it? How do we test it? How do we operate it? How do we know if it's broken? Answering all of these questions. So when it comes to how do we deploy it? Well, we have to actually be thinking about that when we're architecting it, right? If we're architecting something that's going to take advantage of, Amazon Web Services, for example, and be built in the cloud, how is it going to get from our computers or GitHub to AWS? We have to figure out how we're going to deploy it there. Are we going to do it manually? I really hope not. Maybe we're thinking about infrastructure as code. You could use CloudFormation or the AWS CDK, Cloud Development Kit, or Terraform, or all these other tools to write your infrastructure as code so that you can deploy it using an automated system like a pipeline. If we're the ones who are deploying it, that means we also need to have confidence in what we're deploying. So we need to think about how we're going to test our system. Are we going to run through the entire battery of manual tests every single time that we want to deploy code? We don't have a big team, so how can we do all of these things? Maybe you don't have a quality assurance person on your team. You would work with those enabling teams, like the quality assurance people or like operations, to build out a set of automated tests and unit tests and things that you can add to your pipeline to give you confidence that when you deploy this change, it's going to work the way you expected. Maybe you even deploy it for your development branches and you check that it deploys properly with the changes that you've just made. It passes all of your tests. It passes any security checks that you have. There's no vulnerabilities in it. There's no misconfigurations. And then you have all of that confidence before you even merge it to main. And then once it merges to main, it can automatically kick off the pipeline to deploy it to your pre-production environments and run those same tests, and your staging environment and run that same test, and then eventually production if all of that is passed, and again run all of those tests. And at each stage you're building your confidence in the change and in that it's going to deploy properly and work properly for your customers. So all of these things we need to be thinking about when we're actually implementing, when we're designing our solutions, because if we implement it all and then go to add all of our tests, we might not have written the code in a way that's easily testable. So things like test-driven development can be a really cool concept to explore. Actually writing your tests before you've written the software, and then making sure they live up to your expectations, can be really cool. As well as if your team is responsible for responding to incidents, well, you need to know there is an incident, right? So how do we do that? Well, we have to have metrics that tell us what's going on in our system and how it's working. And that comes back to our operations and monitoring. And then we need to have alarms based on those metrics that tell us when something's gone wrong or when something isn't operating to the standards that we've set. And when that happens, we need to know how to respond to that alarm. So at this point, you might be interacting with the site reliability engineering teams and having them enable your team, teach your team how to respond to incidents. What is your company's incident response process? How do you integrate your alarms so that your team gets paged when something goes wrong and you get an interruption to tell you, hey, I'm broken, I need attention, please come help me. And then once you get that alarm, you need to know what to do, right, with the specific problem at hand. So we need runbooks. So when we're thinking about implementing the alarm, we also have to think about, what do I do when this alarm goes off? How do I make sure it's actionable and it's something that I can respond to? And what actions do I need to take? So you can kind of see how it isn't really a circle. It's all intertwined with little connections going everywhere. And there's a lot to take in. It is overwhelming. And that's where all of those enablement teams and all of that experience that you might have in your company comes into play. And we need to get everybody talking to each other so that we can take advantage of all of the experience and all the wealth of information that we have to offer each other. So I just mentioned a whole lot of different areas of things that you might be familiar with, you might have never done before. How do we actually get our teams to fully own all of those different tasks at each stage of the software development lifecycle? As I mentioned before, you kind of need teams that have a broad set of skills. So you no longer need teams of people who only have development skills. You need teams that have skills in development, in operations, in quality assurance, and writing tests, and all these other areas. You might have heard of them called T-shaped skill sets before. In my experience, nobody's a T. Everybody looks a little more like one of these. Everybody's levels of experience will be different in every area. There is no perfect T. But the idea here is that we all have experience. We all have different backgrounds and experience levels in different areas. And we might have deeper knowledge in certain areas and less knowledge in others. And that's okay, as long as our overall team has knowledge in all of the areas that are required to do what we need to do. So the idea here is to build those streamlined teams that have knowledge across multiple areas, and then augment that a little bit with the enablement teams to fill in the gaps and help teach people and change those levels of knowledge as well, and deepen them in certain areas. And how do we do that? Well, we need a culture of continuous learning. This is something that I personally really believe in. And it's something that I try to do everywhere I go, every team I'm on, whether it's at work or with my Embers group of little Girl Guides. I try to really always be open to learning. I think there's something you can learn from everybody that you interact with, whether they're 5 years old or 95 years old, whether it's at work, whether it's out in your community. But when it comes to work and your organization, it's difficult to create a culture of continuous learning because you need to prioritize it. And a lot of the times, I don't know if anybody's heard of the 60-20-20 rule, where 60% of your time is focused on the business priorities, 20% of your time is focused on things like technical debt, and 20% of your time is focused on learning. This is something that I think Google and Amazon and some of the really big companies promote. And in reality, a lot of the time, people don't get time for learning, and they don't feel like they have time for learning, which is, again, a little different, right? If there's too much pressure on delivering the next big feature, people are going to push that feature out and not take that time to learn maybe a different way of doing something that would have helped that feature be more reliable. So prioritizing learning really works both ways. You need support from the top down. You need people from the bottom up who are helping to prioritize that within your teams. Creating learning opportunities is something I think everyone can do. You all have knowledge you can offer other people. There is always somebody ahead of you and somebody behind you when it comes to a skill. And one thing that I like to do here within my teams is if I'm picking up a task and it's something that I've done before and I know how to do it and it's really easy for me, I'll pick it up, and instead of taking it on myself, I'll ask somebody else who hasn't done it before if they'd like to pair program on it. And I will literally sit on my hands because sometimes it is so hard for me not to type anything. But I will give them the reins and I will coach them and teach them how to approach this task and talk them through it and answer their questions and be there to support them rather than taking it on myself. And yes, it is slower. And yes, it can be frustrating sometimes because you're sitting there and you're like, I could have been done this already. But setting that time aside to teach somebody else something is important because now there's two people who know how to do that thing. And if they do that, then it just keeps growing, right? And it goes in the reverse as well. If you're looking at a task and it seems really daunting and you have no idea where to start, ask somebody else to teach you or pair program with you, or how did they do this before? And open those lines of communication so that people feel comfortable asking each other. And speaking of comfort, psychological safety. People need to feel like it's okay to ask for help or ask a question and not feel like someone's going to think they're stupid. They need to feel safe speaking up when they disagree maybe with the approach an architect's taking, and so they can ask questions like, well, have you thought about this, or why did you do it that way? People need to feel safe to fail, right? If we're learning and we're experimenting, you're not going to get it right the first time every time, right? You don't just hop on your bicycle as a kid and automatically know how to drive it. You fall over, you get off, you get back on, right? And you need to feel like that's okay. You need to have the support of your team and learn from those experiences and take them as the opportunities that they are so that the entire team can do better next time. Okay, one more story, one more question, and that's all I got for you. So my current team, as I mentioned, I'm leading developer enablement and developer productivity at Diligent right now. And it's a team of two. It's myself and one other person. At the moment, we own more than 8 microservices and libraries. So that's a lot for 2 people. So how do we manage all of that and actually have time to learn and have time to work on our next service or project or whatever it might be? Well, we put a lot of effort into creating confidence in our pipelines, creating confidence in our testing, so that when we have to make a change to one of those services, we know that we push it to GitHub, our automated tests will run, it will cover the majority of our use cases because you never cover everything. And we know that it's deployed properly, and we have confidence that this change is either going to work when we merge it, or our pipeline has told us that it's not. And we have a lot of different tests and things that we have to pass before we merge it to main. But all of that is automated as much as possible. And whenever it's not automated, we ask ourselves, why not? And if there's anything that we can do to automate that within reason, we will. So we're creating that confidence in our changes, but then how do we know they're working in production for us? Well, we also spent a lot of time adding metrics and monitoring and alarms. So we are on call for our services during our working hours, which means that at any point, if I get an alert telling me that one of my services isn't behaving properly, I can go and acknowledge the alert, and go through our incident response, every single one of our alarms has a run book. We won't merge them into main unless they have a run book. So you have to write it at the same time as you're thinking about implementing the alarm. And one of the cool side effects there is that you have to think about what is the action that someone would take if this alarm goes off. And there's actually been times where we didn't add certain alarms because they weren't actionable. And instead we added widgets maybe to a dashboard so that we can monitor those things and check in on them from time to time, but not be alerted in a fluctuation because it didn't actually signify something that we could act on. We even add, so we add operational metrics, but we also add customer metrics. I wear a lot of hats. So I am our product manager. I am our project manager. I create all of our tasks and break down big pieces of work into manageable things. I do development work. I write tests. I do all different pieces of the software development lifecycle. So we really try to put ourselves and think about what is it the customer needs and how do we know if we're meeting those needs? And we're in a really interesting position because all of the things that we build are for internal customers, are for the development teams themselves. So we actually can go to the teams and ask them, how's this working for you? And respond and see when they have questions about how something's implemented or how to configure something, we go and we update the docs with that information so that the next team maybe can answer more of those questions through the docs and not need us. So all of this effort really goes into making those services autonomous so that we can be very hands-off with them and only have to interact with them when we need to make a change or if we're responding to an incident. So small teams can do it as long as you put in that effort into resiliency, into testing, into creating confidence in your processes and in your microservices so that you can trust them to do what they're doing. Yuri, do we have time for one more round of questions?
Absolutely.
Okay, so my last question for everybody is, how could you improve ownership within your own team or your organization? Yeah. Fire away.
Can I go by voice? Wait.
Hello.
Hello.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah. There is saying which goes, I don't remember exactly, but ownership is not granted. I think it's taken or something like this. So like if managers kind of assign ownership to team members, they will just sabotage. So typically like team members themselves show ownership.
Yeah, I think if I've understood what you're saying is if you tell somebody to do something, they're not going to feel ownership over the decision to do that thing, rather than if they come to the conclusion themselves to do that.
Yeah, there needs to be an intrinsic motivation, I guess. Of course, it boils down to the question like whom do you hire, right? And how do you mentor them?
I like how you added how do you mentor them, because I think everybody is capable of learning. For me, it's about, are you willing to? Do you want to?
Yeah,
because
do
if
you
you
have
don't
time?
care about it,
A lot of a lot of questions.
yeah. If you don't care about what you're building and you're not invested in it, and you won't feel ownership over it, right? But the more decision making that can be done by the people who are closest to that information, and the more that they can learn from people like architects or principal engineers or enablement teams from operations, the more that they can have, the more they build that ability to make better decisions, right?
Yeah, I think it comes from executives to be truly empowering and give teams autonomy. Then this kind of right behavior arises, right? So yeah.
There's another good book. We're actually doing a book club on this right now at Diligent. It's called Turn the Ship Around, by Captain David Marquet. I think it's in this book. There's a line somewhere that says that you cannot empower people. You have to make them capable and feel like they empower themselves. They enable themselves to do a lot of these things. You have to help them, coach them and give them tools. But at the end of the day, the team has to decide for themselves that they're going to take ownership over their service and not depend on another team to go look at their pipeline when it fails, because they actually own that. They should go look into it and seek help when they need it, but try things themselves first and dig into that sort of experimentation and learning. Eric?
Yeah, just a quick thought on this. I think there was a thread I saw earlier where someone put it pretty nicely, where teams, when they're presented with solutions to implement, rather than being presented with problems to solve, then it, I guess, is demotivating, because you can't, think of how to do it yourself. Like, you can't come up with your own solution that you think will solve the problem. You're being told what the solution is, and then you're just there to do it.
Right. Yeah, thank you for putting that so elegantly. That's kind of what I was trying to get at too, is you feel a lot more ownership over things if you are the one making that decision, rather than just being, an automaton and being told what to do. Guillermo?
Yes, a situation we are facing in the place I work is that the developers are now taken into the on-call duties 24/7, something that was not done before when the company was not on this journey to the SaaS world. So what I'm seeing is that a lot of people take pride and some kind of ownership of the work they do, but people, including me, were not ready for that mindset or that chain of mindset that involves being on a 24/7 rotation on call. So that's a friction we are facing right now.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people face that. I know it's definitely been a conversation I've been a part of multiple times. You can't just expect everything to change overnight, right? Like we've just been talking about, people are at different skill levels across the board. And if your team doesn't have the skill and the expertise yet to know how to respond to an incident, then putting them on call is setting them up to fail, right? Rather than having them maybe shadow somebody from the site reliability engineering, see how they respond to incidents, training them on your company's incident response process and all of the steps, ensuring that they actually feel ready. One thing that I've done in the past is had people who are new to the team be the secondary person on call. And then when the alarm goes off, we bring them along for the ride, sort of how people do ride-alongs, right? With like police and things. And they would get to see and help make decisions. And after the incident was resolved, I would ask them, what questions do you have? What parts were unclear? What do you think we could have done better? And they would be part of that incident retrospective as well. And once they were comfortable, they would get elevated to a first responder as well. So that's just one way that you can build some of that confidence. But whether it's incident response or writing unit tests or creating a pipeline, you can't just expect that people are going to magically get this expertise overnight, right? It takes time, and that's where creating that shift and that space for learning becomes so essential.
Yeah, I get that's one half of the problem. The other one I'm hearing is people not signing up for being on a 24/7 on call stuff.
Yeah, I also think that you can't expect everyone to be enthusiastic about suddenly being on call when it wasn't previously part of their role or their responsibilities. It can affect your life outside of work, right? Not everybody is able to take that on for a variety of different reasons, and not everybody wants to. So I think the other thing that's important there is really making sure that you're creating a healthy on-call rotation, not being on call all day, every day indefinitely, or all day, every day, every other week, right? If my team was on call 24/7, then there's only the two of us, and we have one person as primary and one person as secondary responder. That means you are literally always on call. And that's not something that is good for our health, physically and mentally. So you have to come up with ways of mitigating and managing and figuring out what works best for your teams based on their capabilities, based on their preferences and their roles and everything like that. And it's really, really hard to go from an organization that didn't have these people being on call to suddenly asking them to be on call. It's not easy. All right, I'm going to wrap it up there then. Thank you so much for joining me today. I do have a short survey in the nature of learning and continuous feedback. I do this at the end of every session that I do, whether it's at work or outside of work. I really hope you will take a couple of minutes and just let me know what you thought. Yeah, thanks so much for having me, Yuri and Greg, and everyone for joining us today.
Thank you for your time and this fantastic event, and thank you everyone for joining tonight us, and all of you welcome in February for our next speaker, Payam, who actually joined us today, and see you all. Madeline, huge thanks to you.
Thanks.
Yep, thank you everyone. Thank you, Madeline.
Thank you,
Thank you
Madeline.
very much.
I'll toss the link in the chat as well if anybody wants it there. Maybe if I can find it before they're all gone. Maybe not.